So this next video review is a little bit different because I'm not making it in term for you to be able to like follow step by step and do these things. It's more so you can understand the concept of what UVs are, so you can know what it is we're dealing with when you get to the texture mapping homework. So we're now dealing with zip files to download because you're going to need an entire folder to do this. So I've got my folder here, UV Workshop 1. And you'll see in it that there's all these different subfolders. So this is what happens when we use what's called a project in Maya. Because if we're working with textures, like mapped textures, we have to output stuff from Maya that goes in the images folder, and then we have to make some stuff and then input it back into Maya, and that usually goes in the source images folder. Rendered things also go in images. Let's see, and then sometimes if you're caching, I'm sorry, effects. Thank you. And scenes would go in the scenes folder. So it's very common to see this set of folders right here. And when you have a project or when you have a file set to a project, what that means is that whenever you go to save or save as, it's going to dump you right there. If you go to export stuff, it's going to put you in the images folder. Like, it's going to put you in that folder. And so if you want to make sure you are actually attached to a project folder, going to file save as is a good way to do that. Now, if I take this whole project and bring it to another computer, as I did in class, it's not going to necessarily know to follow that project. Your student computers might. The problem is if you're on a computer that was using a different project, it can get confused. So if you want to set a project, you go to File, Set Project, and nothing happens. There we go. And you can find the folder. Where is it here? UV Workshop. Don't double click, just single click and say Set. Right? And that should set your project to this folder. And again, if you go File, Save As, if it puts you in that folder, in the Scenes folder, then you know it's working. If it puts you somewhere else in the default Maya folder somewhere, then you know it hasn't caught yet. And this lack of setting a project can lead to problems later with your textures. It's it's a little bit of a pain, but otherwise it's necessary because if we want to map textures to this. So in this, I've created what is probably the world's simplest shape mesh ever. It's a plane, a bunch of very square polygons, and then I selected that back edge and I extruded it back just a little bit, and that's it. That's all I did. Because I want to explain to you UVs, and I want to explain it in the simplest way possible, because they are a little bit tricky. So I go to my workspace up here and I say UV editing, and it brings up this other editor, and you can see it's kind of like that geometry graph you would have had like in high school, where you've got the X over here and the Y over here, and we pretty much exclusively work in this top portion. But what we need to do is we need to map the surface. And what I mean by that is this is a three-dimensional surface. But if you paint a texture, it's a two-dimensional picture. So we need to create a roadmap so that when we're drawing in a two-dimensional space, we know where we're painting on this. Right? So one of the things we have to do is we have to take a picture of this three-dimensional object. So in this case, I've got it set up to do planar mapping. We'll go over what these are later, but basically it takes a picture. So I click that button and it takes this picture. You can see this is like the camera kind of this surface from this direction. And by the way, on any of these things, if you want an option, you hold down Shift and click it, and it gives you your options box. The default for this would not work correctly. I had to tell it to keep image and height ratio. You have to tell it which axis to go on, right? Like, depending on where the camera is pointing, it's going to get a different picture. I could do a cylindrical map, and it takes a picture around like this. It ends up looking like that. Spherical would also look ridiculous because these are not, this is not a round thing, but a planar map will get close. However, if we're really paying attention, we'll notice this looks like the front of it, but the sides are missing. You can see they're squashed in. So we have to do something to bring out those sides. We've got different ways of looking at things. This button right here shows me that these things are overlapping, like this is behind this, that's why it's two different colors. Or if I right mouse click it, I can actually see if there's two different meshes, which is also a thing you would do. So, how to deal with this? Well, there's lots of different tools to unfold things. They don't really work with something this geometric. I mean, if I try to do that, oh, nothing happened. Oh, select it. That happens. The computer doesn't understand that if this is square over here, we want it to be as square as possible over here. It's just looking at the math of things and saying, well, okay, I want to distort this the least amount possible, this side stuff over here, these pieces, while maintaining this as much as possible. So these aren't very distorted, but it doesn't care that it made it crooked, right? It doesn't really understand what it's doing. And the other thing is that no matter what we do, if you take a three-dimensional object and you cut it open, kind of skin it, almost like a dress pattern, like a dress or a coat is round around a person, but you have to cut it in certain places and then re-sew it back together. So you're either going to have seams or distortions, and we have to, I'm going to undo because that's not helpful. I need to figure out what the best thing is. Now, in the case of what I'm doing, I'm going to have seams, right? I can pretend that, oh, at this corner of the frame or whatever it is, there's two pieces coming together, so I'll play up the fact that there's a seam. Or maybe when I paint the texture, I can do it in such a way that you won't see the seam. I'll hide the seam. Whatever it is, I'd rather a seam than a distortion. But that is a matter of, dealer's choice. You have to kind of pick and choose. There's no right answer. It depends on what your skill set is, what you have time for, all sorts of options. So I used a tool to cut basically a seam here, here, and at each corner. Now, the trick here is first of all, I can try and see if unfolding it would work. Oh, that's a little bit better. It's a little bit better. It's crooked, which sucks. I don't know why. There's no logical reason for this to be crooked right now. I can try to rotate this and make it better, and that might work okay. I can also turn on this one. Yes. If it's all white, it's telling me things are not very distorted. If it starts getting blue and red, it tells me things are distorted. That actually worked better than I thought. There is another way to do this. Let's make sure I still cut it. Yes. So let's say that didn't work out properly, because sometimes it doesn't. So what the person who is unwrapping the UVs has to do is some manual labor. We have to go in and we have to select edges out here, which translates to something out here. And then I can scale them in here. And if I do this, the blue means it's like, oh, you're getting cold, it's too far away. And this turning red means they're relatively too close. So if I pay attention to when it's all in white, that means this is the right size relative to this as compared with this. Now you can see these are red still because they're collapsed in on each other in the back. But these two boxes work in tandem with one another. So what's going on in the 3D view, I can select things in here and it selects them in here, but moving them in here does not move them out here. Wait, that's the wrong one. It can be a little bit hard to tell sometimes what direction you're facing. So if I put this, yeah, I need to be at the back edge of this, not the front edge. So you can see that changing things in the UV editor is not changing things in the 3D view. And that's because it's only changing the map. It's only changing how this is mapped out to itself. There we go. See how it starts out red? It's like, oh, nope, that's too close together. And then it's going to, there we go. It'll turn white once it gets to where it needs to be. Likewise, by the way, if I change something in the 3D view, it does not, it tells me that I now don't have enough screen real estate for this, right? Because these polygons are so much bigger and this is not taking up enough space in here to, to have enough resolution for these areas. Like if I put the same pattern here as here, it'll get stretched when it's out here. This doesn't update because of this. And I'm pretty sure if I go into, I don't know, edge mode, if I try to, that it handles okay. But if I start extruding, forget about it. Um, so for right now, what you would want to do is make sure you really have your model where you want it before you start uncurling UVs. There are tools that can help you to fix things. Obviously, in the in the production life pipeline, they're not finishing their models entirely. There's always going back and fixing things, but they have a lot more tools. They might have specialized proprietary tools. They have systems already set up. When you're first starting out on this, though, I think it's better to really make sure you realize this is a mostly one-way street. This model should be finished before your UV mapping. Another way we can check things, or another way to look at this, is to turn on that checkerboard and be careful. This is, I'm actually, can I turn this down? I like to turn down the severity of this because it can be very, very intense. It can be a lot in this window. And you can still see what's going on in this window. So if I was to select some UVs in here and have the correct tool, there we go, you need a selection tool, and move these in here, you can see what happens. I changed the map out here, and I've added all this space for what is technically just one row of faces. This row of faces is the same size as this one, is the same size as this one, but in my map they're taking up twice as much space, which means they now have twice as much resolution. And that's not great. That's the exact opposite problem as if we put it too close together. And now you can see it's stretched because there's not enough space here. That's what you're balancing. That's what you're worrying about. You have all these tools that can help you check back and forth to make sure things are okay. So I'm going to pause so I can switch to something where things are already exported, and then I will show you how this talks to each other in Photoshop. So through the magic of a pause button, you all didn't have to watch Photoshop try and open itself. So when you are done with mapping stuff in Maya, you export this right here, and it exports as something like this to be brought into Photoshop or the drawing software of your choice. And there are a few things that we can do to make this work better, right? Because let's face it, this is terrible. So it's a JPEG. It gets exported as a JPEG, and so it's flat. We can unlock the layer. I like to invert the layer, which is either image adjustments invert or Control I if you like your hotkeys, and immediately better. This can be any color it wants. It doesn't matter. We're not going to see it later. It's just we need to know where things are. Again, this is like guides in Photoshop. These things where you see them but they don't print. This is the same idea. We don't need to see this grid later, except that we need to know where it is. Because when we take this image and we bring it into Maya to apply to this, then that's when we're going to, tell us how to apply this information to there. So the other thing we can do, or you definitely should do, is make a new layer. So if your UVs are on one layer, then your texture itself should be on a different layer. You can also, this is a Photoshop trick, take your top UV layer and turn it to multiply, which means and also lock your UV layer so you can't mess around with it. You can't move it accidentally. That's the worst. What this means is that when I go to paint on the bottom layer, see how I can see through? It's multiply will get rid of everything in the top layer except for like the darkest part. So if you have a black and white layer, it effectively drops out all the white and keeps the black. So you can color kind of inside the lines and still see the lines. And I use this for drawing a lot. I use this for coloring, drawing as animation and things like that, but you can also use it for your UV maps. All right, so for the purposes of this class for the time being, everything has been provided with already existing setups. So there's, the UV layer, which I did not name, my apologies. So you can see how I set the files up. I've got it locked, and then there's another layer with a drawing on it. So you'll, in order to tinker with these things, you won't have to worry about exporting or setting things up in Photoshop. You can just open this up in Photoshop and draw.